Let's continue then on this particular conversation and bring in Professor Alex Van Den Heever from the Wits School of Governance. Prof, thank you so much for your time. Just, wanting you to weigh in on this particular matter. I mean, the importance of first responders in this case, emergency services, goes without question. I mean, one wonders then why they would also be attacked or come under attack, given the critical role they play, especially in a life-threatening situation.
Well, there are a range of reasons where EMS workers can be placed in danger. Some of those are acts of blatant criminality where they're targeted just because they're in an area relatively unprotected, and they will be going into dangerous areas that where communities live in sort of relatively precarious circumstances from a security perspective. But they're also subject to attacks by families that go into situations where violence is occurring. There might be a range of reasons why people decide that the EMS workers are the problem and attack them. And in many other instances, when we look at trauma-related injuries, they're the result of alcohol-related violence. And so you're going into situations where people are not acting normally. And so you might be subject to both attacks by people who are drunk, as well as people who have been injured severely, who are also inebriated and may also react violently and not be behaving normally. So there are many reasons why first responders are going to be in a very dangerous and precarious position. And this does have to be thought of strategically, because it's not something that you just deal with as and when it happens. You've got to actually think how you're going to minimize the danger. Otherwise, you're going to have first responders refusing to go into particular areas, and people are going to die just because of that.
And I mean, Prof, I want to bring in another reason to that that you've just given. I mean, given that some of these attacks, like you say, may not be criminal in nature, but a reflection of people who are frustrated with their social standing and the neglect of service delivery, for instance. In that particular incident that we were talking about, it was because they were blaming the emergency services, for being late. How should authorities be coordinating better? For instance, the Department of Health saying it's working with SABC, to ensure that these incidents are at the very least curbed.
Yeah, so you can work with SABC to come in, and I heard the response from the Department of Health. I'm not sure that there is a preemptive framework in place to support emergency workers going into high-risk areas. But where communities are upset because they're receiving poor service and there's a big delay, that's not necessarily an instance where sort of SABC is necessary up front, but it becomes a concern because of sort of families reacting. Now, and that's a more complex problem because there are problems with EMS responses, and that has to be dealt with properly, but you can't take it out by attacking workers. So the preemptive response is that you actually have to work prospectively, preemptively with communities, because they have to make the connection between the community response and protecting EMS workers and their own protection. So the problem is that probably there is a minimal framework in place to prepare communities to allow for first responders to access their environments. And this can include informal sector dwellings. There are many very dangerous areas in, say, the Joburg CBD, quite aside from very difficult to reach areas in sort of rural informal settlements. So you want to make sure that those communities have kind of pre-agreed on how they're going to treat people coming into that area, but also how they're going to make sure that criminal elements aren't the ones who are going to take advantage of first responders. But the preemptive response will include SABC where there are known high-risk areas that people are going to go into and high-risk scenarios. As I mentioned, the inebriated people who are fighting on a Friday evening where a lot of trauma occurs is a high-risk situation, and you don't actually want first responders going into that without some kind of additional protection.
And Prof, just looking at things, broadly, you mentioned there, of course, a framework and strategies that probably would need to be implementable. But I mean, just looking at these attacks, how much of these attacks on these first responders are further than hampering the much needed service to communities? Because also, I would imagine by extension, they will probably have a ripple effect on the healthcare sector itself, which has come under heavy criticism from various fronts, including just poor infrastructure, under-resourcing, etc.
Yeah, so the immediate problem is that the first responders are going to delay or defer going into high-risk areas for their own safety. That is incredibly bad when that happens.
Yeah.
And it's almost understandable. But the question is, and this is where I come back to the strategic response, this is something that is known. First responders are vulnerable. They are easily accessible. They go into high-risk areas. They're the people running toward a problem rather than away from it. And therefore, your strategies have to include how you're going to make sure that they can insert themselves into those situations safely. If you don't have a strategy, then what happens is you just wait and deal and mitigate the incidents when they do occur. And that does appear to be what's happening. There doesn't really appear to be a strategic response to this.
Yeah.
It is well known internationally, first responders are in a high-risk situation. It's not just South Africa. And therefore, it is part of the public healthcare's responsibility to make sure that there is some preemptive framework in place to minimize the known harm that is going to occur to them.
And I agree with you, Prof. It's not just South Africa, and also it's not just emergency services, as we've heard earlier on, also doctors and nurses at hospitals also under attack. Prof, but thank you so much for your time. Let's leave it there for now. Professor Alex Van Den Heever there from the Wits School of Governance.